as part of this evidence program that we have on immunization with all these great studies we're supporting, we're also doing some broader taking stock of the evidence on immunization in low and middle income countries. So we'll talk a little bit about that work. So I'm going to start by just describing what an evidence gap map is for anyone who's not familiar with this thing that 3IE does, and then talk a little bit about our process for developing a framework for this mapping exercise in the immunization space, and then talk a little bit about some preliminary findings where we're still in the process of finalizing what we've found through doing this exercise, but I'll share what the patterns that we're seeing so far. So the kind of motivating questions behind an evidence mapping exercise is to look at, well, so for what interventions and for what outcomes in a particular topic area or sector do we have evidence of their effectiveness? So where have there been good quality impact evaluations of how an intervention does in affecting a particular outcome? And how is that evidence distributed? Both what sorts of methods are being used to answer these questions in impact evaluations? Where are the studies taking place? Those kinds of things, and most crucially, how should we invest in future research, and where should we be putting our evaluation efforts to try to fill in any major gaps in what we know about what is effective in a particular space. So this is kind of an idealized picture of the process that 3IE has for identifying and filling and addressing evidence gaps. So we start with this procedure, this mapping, to be able to identify where there are gaps, where additional research is needed, additional evidence. And then we do things like an evidence program over a number of years on a topic like immunization to try to produce some additional evidence to help fill in those gaps. And then we synthesize that evidence, often in combination with what else is out there in the literature. In this case, we started out with a sort of informal and pretty rapid mapping exercise at the beginning of this evidence program. And so we did have some sense of where the major gaps were, and that informed the particular evaluations that we ended up supporting through this window. But now at the end of the program, we're looking to do that in a slightly more comprehensive and systematic way. And so this is to be sort of the fruits of all of that. So the approach to evidence gap maps is we develop a framework, a matrix that looks like this, where we have a series of interventions we're interested in and a number of outcomes that we're interested in. So an intervention could be something like SMS reminders for vaccination. An outcome could be something like full immunization for a child. And when we find a study that looks at the impact of SMS reminders on full immunization, then we put that in the square that's at the intersection of that intervention and that outcome. So we do a broad comprehensive search of the literature, try to find everything that's out there, and then identify what are the interventions they look at, what are the outcomes they look at, and slot them into the different cells in the matrix so we can see where do we have lots of evidence, where is evidence missing. And so when we see that, okay, we don't have any impact evaluations or systematic reviews that are looking at particular intervention and outcome combinations, we know we have a gap. And so we can have, because for these evidence gap maps, we look for both impact evaluations and systematic reviews, we can identify absolute gaps where there are no impact evaluations, looking at a particular intervention outcome combination. And we can also identify what we call synthesis gaps, which is where there have been a number of impact evaluations, but there have been no good high quality systematic reviews to synthesize the findings from those impact evaluations. So that's the basic idea behind doing one of these. And once we complete them, we have an online platform where you'll have the different cells be populated by bubbles, and depending on the size of the bubble, that tells you how much research there is. You can hover over one of them and see what are the studies that have looked at that intervention and outcome pair. So and you can hover and follow up on those links to see what those studies say. We have systematic reviews in there, they're color-coded. It's a nice interactive platform. We don't have this ready for the EGM on immunization yet, but this is ultimately what it'll look like, so we encourage people to go check these out and just play around with them. It's quite a bit of fun. So one quick caveat on what evidence gap maps do not do is weight or synthesize the evidence. So all we're doing when we're populating that framework is looking at, does this study measure the effect of this intervention on this outcome? But we're not looking at, okay, how high quality is this evidence? We're not looking at what does this evidence actually say? And so importantly, more evidence does not necessarily mean that the intervention works. It could be that we have a whole bunch of evidence saying that it doesn't work. So it's just a way of seeing the distribution of the evidence. So that's the background on what EGMs are. And so now moving into actually talking about what we've done with the immunization space. So our aim for this evidence gap map is to look at all interventions that have been studied for their effects on routine immunization outcomes for children under 5 in low and middle income countries. We are also conducting in parallel a systematic review, which will do that synthesis and weighting work where we actually look at what the evidence says for a subset of the studies that we find for the evidence gap map, specifically those looking at the community engagement interventions that were the focus of the evidence program. So we'll have this really broad picture of what is the entire domain of evidence about moving vaccination outcomes, and then we'll be taking a more intensive look at a subset of those. So we're doing these in parallel because a lot of the processes are the same for identifying studies. So as far as how we went to look for studies, we did a broad literature search of academic databases, and we were looking for 3 things. So studies that measure one or more outcomes related to routine immunization. So that could be vaccination coverage, or it could be some of the things that are determinants of vaccination coverage. I'll say more about that in a bit. Looking for things that are impact evaluations or systematic reviews, and that were conducted in low and middle income countries. So we used a search that would hopefully capture everything that was potentially an impact evaluation or systematic review that measured these outcomes in a low and middle income country. And it's purposefully a very, very broad search because we wanted to make sure we're capturing everything. But that also means we capture a lot of things that mention these terms but don't necessarily qualify. And so that's why we have to go through this screening procedure. So just to give some numbers, we started out with over 40,000 records retrieved from the academic search. And after deduplicating, we had about 25,000. And we looked at just the abstracts of those and identified about 400 where we looked at and reviewed the full text. And after all of that and assessing each one according to the inclusion criteria, we identified about 100 impact evaluations and 43 systematic reviews. And I'll stress that these numbers are preliminary. We're still doing some supplementary searches of other potential sources of information or sources of studies, and also continuing to review a few tricky cases. So I'm saying this because I really hope we're going to get over that. We're stuck at 99 evaluations right now, but I'm pretty confident that we're going to get over 100 before all is said and done. So, as I said, one of the key parts of the process is developing this framework, and so I want to say a little bit about how we developed the framework for this. So again, this is meant to be a very broad look at the literature, so looking at both supply side and demand side constraints and determinants of vaccination coverage and vaccination outcomes. And so there's a WHO working group working on this, which Monica is a member, and so we've got kind of the inside scoop on the way that they're thinking about this. And the work that they've done, which I won't go into detail, but the idea is to capture a caregiver's journey, the entirety of their attitudes and thoughts about vaccination, their knowledge about when and where to receive vaccination services, all of the things that go into their decision of, on this day, at this time, I'm going to take my child to this place to receive a vaccination. So it's a really nice aid in developing, what are all of the different determinants that we need to be considering. And so ultimately in this framework, we ended up with 38 specific intervention categories and 43, that's a typo, outcome categories. And this is a pretty broad and expansive framework for 3IE PGMs. About 20 intervention and outcome categories is pretty typical. So we really tried to develop something that was really comprehensive and also pretty fine-grained to be able to capture all of the relevant types of studies. So the intervention categories, we grouped them together by kind of who is targeted by them. So we looked at interventions targeting caregivers, targeting health systems, targeting community leaders, targeting the community as a whole, and also things that are at the sort of policy or institutional level. And we ultimately put them into something like this, where you have these sort of fine-grained categories, and those are all lumped into slightly broader categories, so that we can do analysis at kind of various levels. We can look at very, very fine-grained specific intervention and outcome pairs, or we can start to aggregate because we've arranged them into these categories. On the outcomes, there are sort of three main categories of outcomes. So one is the demand side outcomes. So this encompasses caregivers' attitudes about vaccination, social processes like household decision making. What are the social factors that go into play in helping to determine decisions about vaccination for young children? Caregivers' motivation and intention to vaccinate, which is kind of a step beyond just their general attitudes about it. And also, of course, practical factors like the accessibility of vaccination services, costs to caregivers in particular. We also look at the supply side and sort of the health workforce, both formal health workers and informal or community health workers, the information systems that exist in the health system and their capacity to manage data about vaccination, vaccine availability, things like cold chains, things like stockouts, and finally funding and financing for vaccination services. And finally, we looked at actual health outcomes and vaccination outcomes, so vaccination coverage, and there we broke it down into 14 individual categories for specific vaccination doses, and things like timeliness for full versus partial vaccination. And then we looked at one step beyond that, are we seeing impacts or are impacts being measured on child morbidity and child mortality? So this is what it ends up looking like once you put it all together. And this is at a sort of slightly aggregated level. So these are not the most specific categories. So we've done some level of kind of aggregation just to make the results a little bit more digestible. If you're interested in what it looks like when we actually expand out to every single one, it looks kind of like that. But so basically, the greater the number of impact evaluations for a particular intervention and outcome pair, the darker the square for that intersection in the matrix. And so you can see that this green one here, this is the category for vaccination coverage. So things like what are the coverage rates and what's the timeliness of delivery for vaccinations. We can see that that's got the strongest kind of evidence base. There's a lot of concentration of measuring outcomes for those coverage outcomes. And as you go sort of further back to the left, you're looking at more of the determinants kind of leading up to that. Evidence on outcomes is really heavily concentrated on these coverage outcomes, which is good. That's ultimately what we care about in a lot of ways. And so it's not necessarily a bad thing, but it does mean that we have a lot less to go on when it comes to understanding there's kind of upstream determinants, attitudes in terms of the strength and capacity of the health system. And as mentioned, it's a need to focus on greater diversity of countries that should be represented in the evidence base. So that's it for the highlighted findings, and so I'm looking forward to talking more with the rest of the panel. Thank you.
Thanks, Mark. So I think I'll now turn over to the panel, and I think it may be useful if we can just go down the panel and hear some insights in terms of, now I don't know whether this is new work or whether the panel has earlier had an opportunity to look at other evidence gap maps that maybe 3IE has done or other organizations have done. But how do you think this could potentially be useful to the work that you're doing as a researcher, in terms of, do you think that there are ways other than the way just looking at gaps that this map can be useful to you? So maybe we take Jyoti and then Tracey and then Dr. Ngozi.
The challenge, I think someone in the morning mentioned, the challenge from 50 to 60% is different from, let's say, 70 to 80 and then 80 to 90, which is the target for WHO and for the countries to achieve. So I think for that kind of achievement, this kind of analysis is very useful for policymakers to understand where they are headed, where they should put in those scant resources which we talked about in the morning, and then decide, since we also talked about audience segmentation or the community segmentation, this map could be helpful for that purpose. The only thing I would suggest which will be useful, though evaluation frameworks would have their systems of working, considering that this is, the way immunization is structured as a program in developing countries is different from developed countries where it's offered as very personalized services. So the understanding of the program is also very different. So I think for us here in developing countries which have taken on immunization as part of the EPI program and universalized access wherever possible, it will be useful for including policymakers in developing this evaluation framework. Maybe some of the issues that come out in daily practice, and they would vary from level to level, I would say. Like we have representatives from state level here, the national level, and implementers. So I think some of the key questions, I would not say for each it can be included because you also have a time frame. But yes, this evidence map at different levels of decision making would be a useful tool for policymakers and planners to be a part of. And the second input I would like to give, probably if there is time for you to include, is, in any program there is a scope for exploratory work which needs to push barriers and do something innovative. It may not be proven, it may not be effective, like we discussed in the previous session about formative research, but it is needed to include learning. Whereas so we should have a small component for that. Whereas for a proven and well intervention, there are challenges that can come due to the context. So for that, we need a larger, we need standardized messaging and research evidence, but that should have a smaller area again for doing some kind of research in the local setting to contextualize it. So we should have scope for both exploratory and innovative questions as well as contextualizing known evidence in certain framework, because these contexts are changing.
I think that's really valuable, thank you. It's exciting to see that there's so much evidence out there. So I have one question. I do think obviously it's a huge amount of resource that are great to have available, but I was just wondering why you mentioned that you wouldn't be weighing or synthesizing this evidence. I was just wondering why, or whether that synthesis requires particular research questions, or maybe the involvement of policymakers or others. Maybe that's the point, and it's making a resource available that then could be synthesized by others. It'd be interesting to know what the plan is on that level. And then, of course, as somebody who is more anthropologist, social scientist, I had the same kind of question. Well, what studies are being excluded? Obviously, you excluded an enormous amount of studies. And some of those, like my study, or studies that some of us have done as part of this, would have been excluded because they were formative. And actually, there's probably some really valuable learning from those. Some of it might be quite contextual or might be quite specific to particular interventions, but could be of wider interest for other people. So, and also, I mean, this is not directly to this, but I do think we need to put our thinking hats on in terms of thinking about the methodologies that we might need to develop and are already out there and being used to do evaluations of iterative interventions that will need to be constantly changed and amended and might not lend themselves firstly to an impact evaluation, or maybe so behavioural that couldn't be measured in an impact evaluation. So I think there's some thinking to be done on different methodologies for evaluation, and that evidence shouldn't get lost in this evidence bank.
Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity to be on the panel. Actually, I found the presentation very interesting, and I think it's a very useful resource. The question is, what would I do with it in my work? As a researcher, of course, this is the sort of thing that interests me because it does shows us where the gaps are and explains a lot about why we do certain studies where we're focused on the coverage. And then we get certain results that we don't expect because we've kind of missed the nuances, the determinants, the things that lead up to those, what we're looking for. And I think when we look at the evidence gap maps and the gap map you've already developed here, and we see that a lot of those determinants need more thorough study. We need more evidence on what actually drives immunization utilization and what actually helps from the supply side as well. Then that gives more clarity on where we should be and what sort of research questions we should be asking, eventually what sort of evaluation questions also we should be asking, and where the scarce resources can be used to get the evidence that we need. I think those are things I think I would say that we need from, and that the gap map would really help us with. And just to make it a bit more contextual, one of the things in going more into deeper analysis of the community-based participatory research we did was to understand that yes, we involved communities to a very intense level, up to the point of empowerment. But and you see the results. But when you go a bit deeper in analysis, you will start seeing that there are also intra-community dynamics that drive the process. That there are power dynamics, there are asymmetry in relationships that you really need to understand so that you would know how to structure things better the next time. And those are the kind of studies you want, evidence on. To really understand, it's not just about using community involvement or community collaboration or all that, but it's about understanding more about the dynamics that undergird those type of activities. So yeah, it's useful.
I think, Mark, there are some questions for you, so would you like to first respond to those questions?
Sure, yeah. So first on the question of kind of why stop at just mapping the evidence rather than actually synthesizing and seeing what does it actually say. So I think it's largely just that EGMs are a tool for answering specific kinds of questions, but not other kinds of questions. And so they're just have different goals from systematic reviews. And so this kind of really big picture and very easily digestible, once you've got a visual framework of just seeing, okay, here's where the evidence is, here's where the gaps are, is just kind of targets different kinds of questions and different types of users from a systematic review that actually does synthesize the evidence. And one advantage to EGMs is that they are often a lot less resource intensive. You just don't have to do all the work of digging into the findings and trying to synthesize them. So they can do a lot of what systematic reviews will do by telling you kind of what's out there, and if your search is comprehensive enough, okay, well here's everything. And that can be a validating source. Other people can build on it. You can, in the next phase, build on it. So they're kind of a stepping stone in a lot of cases to additional work. But yeah, they do have that limitation, and that's one of the reasons why at least for the community engagement interventions, we're not stopping at the just mapping phase. But just doing the gap map allowed us to cover the entirety of the immunization space, even if we're not doing the detailed analysis that would be for systematic review on that. And then also the question on kind of what's been excluded. Well, the answer is a lot, obviously. I think we went from 25,000 abstracts down to 400 full text, and a lot of those are probably just really good research studies that tell us a lot about how immunization is, the determinants of it, and they can teach us a lot about how things, how things are implemented and things like that. They aren't impact evaluations, and so EGMs are again just a tool for kind of seeing, okay, where is this particular kind of evidence? We often say evidence as like just a shorthand for meaning this particular kind of evidence you get from impact evaluations and systematic reviews. And so that's one reason why I think we're really looking forward to getting onto the systematic review stage, because one thing we'll be doing is, once we've kind of identified here are the kind of programs that have been subjected to these rigorous impact evaluations, we're going to go and look what else can we find about these, perhaps formative evaluations, perhaps process evaluations that can help us really understand, okay, yeah, there's an impact evaluation that said this had this effect or had no effect. Let's see if we can understand, the context. Are there features that keep coming up about the ones that have effects do these things, the ones that don't have effects don't do these things? So I think there's, lots of room for that kind of, those other types of research, but they just don't lend themselves to being depicted in a gap map framework.
That might be then why you had your initial kind of thoughts about that impact evaluations will probably have to focus on coverage and outcome, rather than maybe you could do something like improved attitudes, true, but it would be less likely to find something that looks more at the health system in an impact evaluation. I'm just imagining. Whereas you might find that more in-depth, detailed, maybe more descriptive in different types of evaluations that were then excluded. But which would be great then if you can go back with the community engagement one, look at both angles.
I think also the other drawback that happens with if such factors are excluded is that, we've talked about the lack of determinants. So many of the issues would be covered in studies which are done that show why a particular intervention works, and what are the challenges that even if it was good on paper or it is known to be very helpful, it actually didn't work in many parts of different countries. So that knowledge is again going to be lost if it's not captured in the evidence map. And I think the larger issue for me is that this evidence gap map, I understand from you, will be a very useful tool, for example, for national level resources, donors to direct the program and get that evidence. Now, if we are excluding such research, again we are entering the chicken and egg story of continuing to focus only on, let's say, coverage. So usually it ends up being in terms of numbers, so it's a quantitative estimate, the quality parameters tend to get missed, the nuances of what work either at the community level or even in the supply side will again get missed, and those are the evidence I think which even policymakers are looking for or researchers are wanting to generate. So we should probably, it's a tough task, I understand, but if there is a mechanism like your map is a beautiful graphic tool of showing the big gaps, I could see, I don't know where they lay, but it looks, really, it's sad in some sense if there are big gaps, but that could be partly because the data can't be made public or the data is not available easily, it falls between the cracks. So is it a problem that is answerable and should we be looking at it? And if it already exists, maybe we should not ignore it in such studies, is my only point.
Yeah, because I think actually when we're talking about impact, for instance, impact always looks at things, and the impact you're looking at is quite different from when you're talking about determinants. That's at another level altogether. So when you put them all in one map, you will see these big gaps, of course. Because if you're going to say we're not going to say impact of this hasn't been done, or for instance, what's a good example of something you wouldn't check the impact of, but there are things that at the impact level, you're looking at very quantitative details, for instance, and so you're going to have these big gaps. So at the end, well, what you really want to know is what do you want to do with evidence gap, like on immunization, because immunization usually looks, the bottom line for immunization is coverage. That's the bottom line. That's what people want to know. So.
I think, Mark, do you want to also clarify in terms of that coverage is the most studied outcome, but then you're looking at other intermediate outcomes, because I think you talked about attitudes.
Yeah, just to briefly clarify, so we have things in the map that are like impact evaluations where there was an education program directed at caregivers, and they measured like an index of their knowledge on a questionnaire about when and where to receive vaccinations and their attitudes towards vaccinations, so you can measure, okay, baseline, endline, treatment control, what was the impact of this educational intervention on caregivers' attitudes, and then so the value of having that is we know that attitudes and knowledge of that sort is going to be a determinant of coverage. And so if you are in a situation where you need to, that like lack of knowledge and attitudes are a barrier to coverage, vaccination coverage in your area, in your community, that evidence can be informative. Okay, how do I address that particular constraint? Whereas in other places, it might be less of a demand side constraint and more of a supply side constraint. And so hopefully the map, it helps you find evidence on addressing those kinds of constraints. So that's the idea behind including those intermediate things. And I think Tracey made a really great point about that just being less susceptible to kind of impact evaluation type research than the kind of coverage outcomes. So.
The other thing I want to say that, obviously within impact evaluations, I think there's more and more of a move towards embedding process evaluations or embedding some sort of other data collection that can look at or explain mechanisms of why something worked or didn't work. And I think that's something it's important, it's a great new move. But I'm also wondering, and this is in our minds as we're writing up our results, how many of the papers that you've got in your evidence map actually report negative findings? And so where does that evidence go? Sorry. No, because we know there's a publication bias, and a lot of journals will not publish negative findings, even though they say they will, but they would have a bias towards publishing stuff that is showing a positive. And a few of us here, we've got negative findings, and we're having to think about how do we publish these and because what we've learned is really important. Like in the Uganda study, what we actually learned, what we saw, what we think, is that the supporting activities actually were driving the increase of overall immunization across control intervention, and that's important. And that, Benjamin said they went back to the communities and told them, if you did your job, we'd probably not have a problem. I don't know, I'm being a bit crass, but it's, that evidence also needs to be published. And I'm just out of interest, I don't know, maybe not watching that details, how many of them were actually negative as well?
Just very briefly, so we haven't looked at that. We can look at that in another stage of analysis if we can find the time. But one thing I will say is that we do look for great literature, things that are not published in journals, partly to try to address that kind of publication bias. Hopefully something might be published as a working paper, even if it's not in a journal, if there are negative findings. It doesn't completely address the publication bias issue, but it's one strategy that we have.
I think we are very grateful for all the comments and all the suggestions and all the rich discussions that we've had. And I think that is the point. The whole point of a workshop to bring people from all over the world from different parts of India. And with all the carbon footprint that we are putting in, because of all this travel, there must be a value added. The value added is all the rich discussions that we are having over here, all the lively debates, the concerns, we hear it, your concerns about it, about certain things that we are doing. Your suggestions, your comments, everything is very well taken. I have a very difficult task of giving the closing remarks. I can't even think of, I'm trying to think that how do we synthesize all the rich discussions that we have over 4 days. Because I think certain people who are here, they only hear the public conference day, so I'll just limit myself to what my takeaways are from the whole day of very, very rich discussions. I think the first panel, Arindam summarized it very well. Should we allow for more time for impact evaluations, in which we think that the impact is going to be we cannot see the impact in 1 year. It's a thought, it's something for us to think about, and we will think about. 3 C's, I thought you really put it up very well. 3 C's for scalability, sustainability, and sustainability, the cost part. It is so evident. It was something that was discussed, when we had the cost panel in detail. That it is so important to think about cost. Budget optimization is something that Arindam brought out. The context, I think that is one thing that has been, talked about through the whole day, how context is very important, how it's so important that first of all, we need to understand the barriers to immunization in different contexts. And we should actually allow for decentralized decision making and give, the decision makers a basket of choice at a very, sub-regional, sub-regional level to be able to really, improve the immunization outcomes and achieve the goals that we would want. And the third thing, compatibility with health systems. It's extremely important. We know how difficult, and it has been brought out, that to translate the evidence from the proof of concept to scale it up into the existing health system, it's a mammoth task. And we need to think more about, how do we, and there is less thinking in this area, how do we actually translate evidence from proof of concept to actual scalability. The cost panel, I thought, some great suggestions have come. Incentives for researchers, what are those? How do we set standards? We need to develop capacity of policymakers and researchers, all great points. User findings I've already said. One key takeaway, I thought it was very interesting how we talked about the decentralized decision making. And also co-designing of interventions. I think that was also something that really came out, that it is really important. When the policymakers said, do come to us and discuss, what you plan to do. It is very important for your interventions, for what you are thinking to be successful. If you don't go through that stage, one, it may not happen. Second, it may not be successful because you've missed very fine points from people who have been working in this area day in and day out. So excellent point on that. I thought this very likely could lead to formative evaluations. The researcher bias, and I was just having a side conversation. I think that is a concern, not just with formative evaluations, but we also have with impact evaluations. And that is something, for 3IE, we are just 10 years old. We have come a long way, we have learned a lot, and we're still learning. And we're still trying to address, as we see this, the concerns, and some valid, very valid concerns coming out of the work. All this discussion provides us the guidance. How do we make our processes, standard settings, the guidance documents, better? How do we strengthen them? So thanks a lot. I think it was really valuable. On the EGM, we are really grateful. As I said, right in the beginning, for all the comments and suggestions, I can see, the concern that because we have those gaps in the determinants of immunization because of our inclusion criteria of, because the way that, we say these are only impact evaluations, and the impact evaluations only mostly look at the coverage outcomes. Well taken, something. So I would say, all in all, a lot of food for thought for us, and all these, food for thought and discussion is not only going to help us in taking our immunization evidence program work, better in the future, but it's also, there's so many issues, concerns have come up, and that is going to take us for us as a 3IE, not just for the immunization work, but to all our wider work also to how to strengthen it. So thanks a lot, everybody.